For 362 days, Ukraine stands strong against the forces of the Russian invasion. Yesterday, Ukraine marked Heavenly 100 Remembrance Day. On this day, in 2014, first killings of peaceful protesters started at the Maidan. Overall, over 100 people were killed. Yesterday, the President of the United States, Joe Biden, visited Ukraine for the first time since he became the president. Since early morning, social media users started to share information about large portions of Kyiv being blocked by security forces, and many assumed that it was due to some foreign visitor. Some even guessed correctly that it was due to the visit of the US president. Ukrainian users, restaurants and shops started to share photos from different parts of Kyiv with Joe Biden photoshopped there. In reality, the US president met his Ukrainian colleague Volodymyr Zelensky, laid flowers to the wall of remembrance of those who died for Ukraine, and held a press conference, reports Interfax Ukraine. The US president said that his visit should reaffirm the unwavering commitment of the United States to democracy, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. He said when Putin launched his invasion nearly 1 year ago, he thought Ukraine was weak and the West was divided. Biden stressed that Putin was wrong, and 1 year later, here we stand together, united with the people of Ukraine. The US leader announced another military support package for Ukraine worth $500 million, reports European Pravda. The Pentagon later clarified that the package includes additional ammunition for the HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems, artillery shells, mortar rounds, 4 radar systems, additional Javelin anti-tank systems, and about 2,000 anti-tank missiles. 4 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 2 tactical vehicles, Claymore anti-personnel mines, night vision devices, communications equipment, medical supplies, and spare parts for machinery. Biden also said later the United States will announce new sanctions that will not allow circumventing the sanctions mechanisms. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called Biden's visit to Kyiv the most important in the history of Ukrainian-US relations, reports Interfax Ukraine. He reminded that it is the first visit of the US president in 15 years. According to Zelensky, during the meeting they discussed the issue of long-range weapons and weapons that can be supplied to Ukraine. Zelensky said that they both have a joint vision of further developments and prospects in this war. The president informed that this week, together with the United States and 60 other powers, Ukraine is submitting a draft resolution in support of peace to the UN General Assembly. And on the eve of February 24th, the approval of this resolution will be evidence that the terrorist force will never break civilized law, Zelensky said. He also added the results of this visit will be felt on the battlefield in the liberation of our territory. In his evening video address, the president said that they discussed how to do everything to ensure our common victory this year in the war that Russia unleashed. We have to do everything to put an end to Russian aggression this year, to liberate our still occupied territories, and to guarantee reliable security for our country and for all the peoples of Europe who want to live in freedom and peace, emphasized Zelensky. The Guardian informed that National Security Advisor to the US President Jake Sullivan spoke about the details of Joe Biden's conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv, reports Ukrainska Pravda. According to him, they talked about the coming months on the battlefield, about what Ukraine needs, about the opportunities for success. Presidents also discussed Ukraine's needs in energy, infrastructure, economic and humanitarian support, as well as the political side of the matter, in particular about the upcoming session of the UN General Assembly. They touched upon the Ukrainian peace formula and Ukraine's efforts aimed at gaining international support for a just, stable and lasting peace built on the principles of the UN Charter, the main of which are sovereignty and territorial integrity. Sullivan hinted that Biden and Zelensky might have talked about specific weapons systems, including F-16 fighter jets, but provided no details. Jake Sullivan confirmed information shared by the media that Russia was warned in advance about US President Joe Biden's visit to Kyiv, reports Radio Liberty. According to him, the information was provided a few hours before Biden's visit to avoid any moments that could lead to the conflict between two nuclear states. The media also informed that Biden arrived in Kyiv on a train from Poland and returned the same way. The Highlights from Ukraine podcast is an uncommercial initiative of just two people, and we need your help to grow. Share information about the podcast, rate us in the apps, subscribe to our Patreon. With your support, we are getting better. According to Bloomberg, the Chinese plan for the peaceful settlement of the Russian war against Ukraine contains calls for a ceasefire and immediate stop of arms supplies to Ukraine, reports Interfax Ukraine. European officials familiar with the plan, who wish to remain anonymous, said that it is expected that Putin may make similar remarks during his speech in Moscow on Tuesday and could potentially propose a draft UN resolution on February 24th to compete with the resolution proposed by Ukraine. Earlier in an interview with the German media Die Welt, Volodymyr Zelensky said that if China were to ally with Russia, there would be a world war, and China is aware of that. It is important for Ukraine that China does not support Russia in the war, the head of state said, adding that at the moment it is impossible to have China on Ukraine's side. EU High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy Josep Borrell said that if China supplies Russia with weapons to wage war with Ukraine, it will cross red lines in relations with the European Union. Ukraine expects to reach agreement with the International Monetary Fund to launch a new multi-year major program in the amount of more than $15 billion, reports Ekonomichna Pravda. This was stated by the Prime Minister following his meeting in Kyiv with the head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva. It is planned that the program with the IMF will consist of two parts: immediate financial support and support for structural reforms that will contribute to recovery. At the same time, Japan plans to announce a new $5.5 billion financial aid package for Ukraine, reports Interfax Ukraine. The announcement will be made at the G7 meeting on February 24th. If you like what we do and would like to tip us, you can now do so directly to our PayPal. Check out the link in the description to this episode for more details. And as usual, you can subscribe to our Patreon. In gratitude for your help, we will give you access to a series of exclusive episodes on wartime life in Ukraine.
President Biden and President Putin are giving dueling speeches today in the run-up to the one-year mark of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Putin spoke earlier today, doubling down on support for the war. He also said Russia will suspend observing a key nuclear treaty with the U.S. Biden's speech in Poland is expected to repeat his firm stance against Putin's war. Yesterday, Biden made a surprise visit to Kyiv where he underscored U.S. support for Ukraine. The U.S. has sent tens of billions of dollars in military and financial aid to Ukraine in less than a year, with more on the way. USA Today looks into how difficult it is to track that aid. Ukraine's leaders and international observers acknowledge the country has dealt with corruption, so there are growing questions as to where the money and weapons could end up. USA Today Pentagon reporter Tom Vandenbroek explains.
There have already been some signs of corruption. There's been folks in the defense ministry fired for inflating the price of food that they bought to skim profits from that. So that's the concern, that all of this money is coming in so fast that there are going to be profiteers.
The Pentagon's Inspector General says that monitoring in Ukraine isn't being done to Defense Department standards. Weapons can at least be theoretically tracked using serial numbers. Money, Vandenbroek explains, is harder to get a handle on.
John Sopko, who's the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan reconstruction, who's a critic of how the money's being spent, has said that that's the sort of money that can be easily lost or misused or misspent because you're paying people at border crossings to get stuff in, and that money can be easily skimmed. So that kind of money, that kind of aid is much more difficult to track.
A federal report last month said some U.S. agencies had trouble accounting for billions of dollars in Ukraine aid spending. This was also a challenge in Afghanistan. But when the U.S. had troops on the ground, they could help monitor aid distribution. That's not possible in Ukraine because Biden has promised to keep U.S. combat forces out of the country. Corruption prevents aid from reaching the Ukrainians who need it, and it could undermine U.S. support for helping the country.
We've already seen some softening in support for aid to Ukraine, wondering why this $113 billion in the last year is being spent there when there are problems here. And when you see corruption and the money misused, those concerns only get amplified and support softens for it.
The special inspector who oversaw aid to Afghanistan says there should be a similar person overseeing aid to Ukraine. Turkey and Syria are recovering from a powerful new series of earthquakes. One yesterday was magnitude 6.4, killing at least 8 people and injuring hundreds more. The Guardian shared a video of people taking cover at a Turkish airport as the ground shook. This comes 2 weeks after more powerful earthquakes and aftershocks killed more than 47,000 people. The latest quake is making a strained recovery even harder. Patients had to be evacuated from some health facilities when new cracks were seen in the buildings. The Wall Street Journal's Chao Deng reports from Turkey on what it's been like for people who are already dealing with very recent trauma.
People are understandably worried here. Some people had to evacuate their homes 2 weeks ago. I talked to some ladies who said that they would rather sleep outside instead of going back home. And also other people who, sleep basically in warm clothing in case they have to rush outside again.
And those are people whose homes were not ruined in the quakes. Turkey's disaster management agency estimates that close to 400,000 apartments have been destroyed or seriously damaged, and many people are still missing. Today and tomorrow, the Supreme Court hears 2 cases that might reshape the internet as we know it. Both focus on a part of the nearly 30-year-old Communications Decency Act called Section 230. It gives tech platforms broad discretion over content moderation, legal immunity for almost all third-party content hosted on their sites, and protection from lawsuits over taking down objectionable content. Now, this policy has critics on the left and the right who say it gives tech platforms too much power and not enough accountability. The tech platforms say that this law is vital to their businesses. A group funded by tech companies, including Google and Apple, has called on the Biden administration to protect Section 230. And some civil liberties advocates say the law is important for protecting online speech. Today's case is brought by a family whose daughter was killed in the terror attacks in Paris in 2015. They argue that Google's platform, YouTube, is liable for damages because it failed to take down ISIS videos and recommended some to users. The family says Section 230 does not protect the tech company here. Now, Google says that interpretation of the law would increase the legal risk for it and other tech companies that curate, rank, and sort online content. It says companies like it could be driven to 2 extremes, either being very strict and removing a lot of content, which could limit online speech, or giving up on moderation completely, which could mean more problematic content online. In tomorrow's case, another family of a terror attack victim says Twitter and other social media companies helped ISIS by hosting user content that expressed support for the group. Twitter argues that just because ISIS uses its platform, that's not the same as Twitter providing knowing assistance to it, and it argues that Section 230 gives it immunity. The court's rulings won't be known for another few months, and it's possible it could resolve these cases without sweeping changes to Section 230. But there are signs that some Supreme Court justices are eager to take a close look at the law. We'll get an early sense of how this court feels about it today, when justices put questions to lawyers on both sides. I read a lot of Roald Dahl books as a kid. I'm pretty sure I broke the spine on my copy of Matilda. I read it so many times. It's one of the reasons that this conversation in the publishing world caught my attention. See, changes are coming to some of Dahl's classics, decades after they first hit the shelves. His publisher and the Roald Dahl Story Company, which manages the rights, are working with a group called Inclusive Minds to change hundreds of words in Dahl's books. They say this will make the books more accessible. These changes to Dahl's work have sparked a heated debate that the Washington Post has been following about whether it's okay to change a book, ever, but especially after an author's death. Some words have been removed altogether, like the word fat. Augustus Gloop from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is now described as enormous. Gender-neutral language is being used for some characters, like the Oompa Loompas. In some cases, new sentences have been added. In the book The Witches, the characters are bald and wear wigs. A new line explains that women wear wigs for other reasons too, and there's nothing wrong with that. Now, Dahl's books are globally famous, but he left behind a complicated legacy. Critics have said that his books are at times bigoted, racist, and sexist. He called himself anti-Semitic. The Roald Dahl Story Company says these changes were small and carefully considered, a way to make sure the stories can be enjoyed by all children today. PEN America, a nonprofit that advocates for literary freedom, says the changes are the wrong approach. Instead, publishers should consider an introductory note that prepares the reader and gives context. Salman Rushdie weighed in on Twitter, and he was blunt, writing, "Roald Dahl was no angel."